Mr. Davies, how do you define ICTs, and in what ways do you see them as being integrated in Africa's education systems? How does Intel fit in this process?
Well, the ultimate goal of ICT in education is where each of the students has access to computing devices, and they use them for collaboration, they use them for creativity, they use them to advance their knowledge, critical thinking, so that they'll prepare themselves for 21st century skills. And really it's about access to that device. That means teachers have to be trained to help the students. It means content needs to be electronic, and you need to change some of the learning processes in schools, so it's not just a teacher lecturing process, it's a teacher enabling process, and that's why we need the teacher training skills.
Can you describe some of these technological tools to us?
Well, the tools are typically PCs or tablets, or maybe in future they could be mobile phones, but they're used in the classroom with content that's electronic and interactive and immersive, so I'm working with the content, I become part of it, and they're usually networked in the classroom so the teacher can see what most of the students are doing and interact with them remotely.
Why is Intel so interested?
Two reasons. One is it's a very good business, and that's always a good sustaining reason to invest in an area. And second, it's the most important thing a country can do. It's about people, and countries want to train their people for the future. It's an area that investments are increasing in, and we think technology can really make a difference there, and we're trying to adapt the technology so it's the right technology for education, not just technology for technology's sake.
How do you combine technology, education, and Africa at a policy level first and then at a practical level, making these projects become a reality on the ground?
Well, we have education programs in 24 countries across Africa. Some of them are focused on training teachers, others are focused on getting lower cost to equip university students with computers, others are involved in the content and the more complete transformation that needs to happen in the classroom. And so we bring all of those programs there. Now in Africa it's a question of I need to be connected, so that's been a big focus. I need to get more teachers trained. We've trained 1.3 million in Africa on Intel Teach, but that's nowhere near the number of teachers in Africa. There's much more needs to be trained. And get the content there in electronic form and interactive, immersive form, so that can drive that, and all of that needs work. It's happening in pieces in many countries, and more completely in a few countries. I think the proof points do exist here in Africa that countries can aspire from and replicate.
Here in Africa, we are faced with big challenges. Many of our people do not have access to education, and they're illiterate, and we need to reach them out. And we do have, yes, schools. We're opening them up, physical schools in a traditional way, but we believe that ICTs can also bring a new opportunity to reach the people who otherwise would not be reachable for education through distance learning. We believe very much that this will be the future, and also will help us to leapfrog so that we'll be in a continent where there is a sustainable development like in other parts of the world.
When you think about using technology to further education, are you primarily thinking of children, adults, or decision makers?
We're thinking about all of them. We need to reach the adult, because first adults, because we need to, those who are illiterate, and they use cell phones, for example. And if we reach them out, then they will be able to help their children there. But also, simultaneously, we need to target, children, because children normally, they go to normal school, yes, but sometimes they don't have anyone to help them to advance in terms of, the education home. But if we target also, the adults through, other, means, not just computers, but now we have got smartphones, then we believe that this will just bring a revolution in terms of education.
How theoretical are these programs for now, or has this technological integration already started in your countries?
No, it's not theoretical. Back in 2011, the government approved the technological plan for education, where we have got all set of objectives and targets and the way just to implement this plan. The government, yes, is set to facilitate access to computers and laptops to teachers. We have got right now more than 150,000 teachers, and we have got a program where we are channeling laptops to teachers. It's very important to target teachers because they will just use this as an important tool of learning, but also teaching, and also bringing in more children to understand more about computers. We do have also a strategy of reaching out university students. We believe this must be followed immediately because we now have been only planning as part also of our strategy of financing higher education. We want to target students so that they will have access to either laptops or tablets subsidized. This is critically important because we don't have good libraries for university students. And we are massifying also access to higher education. During the last 10 years, for example, we have jumped from 22,000 students to 130,000 students. And resources to buy books, physical books, the way we know them, they are not enough. But we believe that with access to technology, we can, yes, provide, manuals, textbooks to students cheaply, because we can work with editors and many others providers so that they can provide books in electronic form, which is much cheaper than buying physical books.
Can technology really mend the educational gap in countries where literacy rates are extremely low? Or are there certain minimal education level prerequisites in order to take advantage of these ICT platforms?
I think, technology is a way of, as I mentioned earlier on, of leapfrogging. We need to bet on technology because it facilitates access to much information, for example, financial information, and some motivation. If you're in the countryside right now, people are motivated to go to literacy, campaigns because they want to be able to use their cell phones, and through their cell phones they can transfer money, and we're expanding to the rural areas, financial services, and people, they are eager to be able to use this resource. So this is just motivating people just to learn more.
What role does ADEA play in integrating ICTs into Africa's educational framework?
Basically, ADEA is a policy forum network. It exists in order to promote sustainable development in Africa through human resources development. So obviously, as the Honorable Minister and Mr. Davis have said, we think it is very important that if there is a facility like a laptop, like any device, which can be made available, that we will actually promote this in the context of advancing education in Africa. Think about it seriously. There are 30 million children in Africa who are out of school. There are any number of adults who have been to school for 5 or 4 years who cannot read and write. There are even many more who have never been to school. Clearly, to be able to train all the teachers that we require for such a huge army or armies of people is going to be very, very expensive. If there was a method that we could actually use technology in order to train our teachers, initially, personally, I would like teachers to be taught how to use computers to teach illiterate people and the students how to read. Because if they can read, they probably can spend the rest of their life using reading in order to learn. And this, for me, is really one of the things we have not focused sufficiently on. I'm on an international task force on learning outcomes. And one of the things which has become very clear is that reading is really the key to learning. And so if there is a way that we can actually use computers and any other devices in order to teach our teachers the ground rules of how to teach children the basics of reading, we will really overcome a major handicap. Because as the minister says, information today is readily available. And if you can read, you can actually self-teach. The only question that would arise, therefore, would be the cost of the devices themselves. Are they to be subsidized? Do we consider it as a basic right that they should be subsidized through tax concessions? What about the telecommunications themselves? Because in many countries, they are so heavily regulated, they are just so expensive that even if people had access to tablets, they would not be able to afford. Somebody was telling me that in one country, they installed computers in a school, and they were told that it would cost $1,000 to be on the internet. The school had never seen $1,000, so they immediately said, we're not going to take the computers. Whereupon, fortunately, the head of state said, just reduce it by a quarter or something, or by half. But you have all these challenges, you see. Challenges, first of all, of how do you reach so many people in a very, very effective way? And I think this holds a good opportunity for us in Africa.
As Chairperson was saying, there's 30 million children who are not in school, and the majority of those children are children with disabilities. And for that reason, it's important, while we're having this debate on ICT, that we make cognizance of those children. We actually make provision for them from the onset now, and make sure that ICT is accessible for children with disabilities. And that means with the advent of material and content being available electronically, we must make sure that that content is also accessible, that there's flexible copyright so that we can enlarge text, do different things with the content to make it more accessible for persons with disabilities. So we're looking at not just we're enabling students with disabilities then to participate in the learning and teaching process in the class more effectively. At the moment, when we look at university level, only between 30 to 44% of universities have access to assistive technology for students with disabilities in low and middle income countries. That's very few. And worldwide, only 5 to 15% of children with disabilities who are currently in school actually have access to the assistive technology and ICT that they require to be able to learn. So it's important that we don't leave children with disabilities or people with disabilities behind, and make sure that in their policies, in teacher training, we make sure that teachers are also trained about accessibility, what technology is available for students with disabilities, how to use the existing setups within technology, because lots of things are universally accessible. There are ways you can adapt your regular computer to be able to, for someone who is visually impaired to use it, or hearing impaired to use it more effectively, or someone who has problems moving a mouse, how we could adjust the mouse as well. There are all these applications within lots of technology today, but people aren't aware of that. So I think that's one of the big challenges, to make sure that there are, and to train both teachers and students.
In terms of access to technologies, I think we need a partnership, public-private partnership. It's very important. And in Mozambique, we do have such experiences which have shown that, in fact, it works. For example, a private provider of cellular technology and communication, they have signed an agreement with the government, and they're providing internet free of charge for 4,000 schools. This is very significant. And we're talking about only one provider. But if we manage, for example, to convince other providers, then this will decrease, of course, the costs of, reaching out, children there. And also we need a partnership with the companies that produce these devices, so that we will find a way of producing very cheap devices, working devices, reliable devices that will reach the people, the needy people there at the grassroots. Of course, the government is very important also, because the government must work just to waive, for example, taxes and many other charges which normally they occur in this process. And I think if we'll join the effort, in short term, all our children will have access to technologies.
I completely agree with Deputy Minister in that there's tremendous amounts of areas that the government and the private industry and the NGOs can cooperate together to get the cost out. You've seen the cost of computers has come down. The cost of tablets may be cheaper in a number of cases, and there's getting some very cost-effective smartphones. But there's also the cost of the internet, and there's the cost of financing the equipment. And so many of our best programs touch on all of them. We have programs, for example, in Senegal where the World Bank does a loan guarantee to the banks so that they'll give much lower interest rates for the university students to own a laptop. Then you go to the telecoms and say, look, we've had the prepaid voice model for years in the phones. It's why most of the people in Africa have prepaid phones. They can pay for it as they have money and pay in small amounts. Do the same for broadband. And they did in Senegal. Then you look at the very poorest people and you say, but you have a universal service fund. Why can't that be universal for the very lowest incomes to also have this? And we found some fairly decent, and then you go to the computer people and say, look, if you're going to sell quite a number, then you can give us a much better price on the volume, because we're not just dealing with tiny volumes. And the government can look and say, well, if it's for teachers, and the biggest factor might be the VAT, maybe they give them a coupon or a voucher that covers the cost of that without needing to change the tax laws. And when you put all of that together, I've seen some very strong, massive programs globally, and some of those exist in Africa, where you can literally get teachers, university students far, far more affordability than just by looking at one piece. You address every single piece of the cost. And along the way, the students that have the that are more physically challenged, technology has to address that. Touch, sound, image, gesture has to become more and more commonplace and easy, so we're not paying enormous amounts of money for very customized peripherals. They're on all computers, and it becomes commoditized, and it can address the sound for people, or the touch and the sensitivities of that, which I think can help the disabled people just a little bit more than technology is doing today.
Yeah, and we have to really look at ways to improve those accessibility features within existing technologies. We want all technologies to become universally accessible, so that will enable people with disabilities to use them. But of course, there are naturally going to be cases where you're going to need additional assistive technologies, which does cost a lot of money usually. But if there will become less and less the need for that once devices become more universally accessible. So we should be pushing for that and make sure that governments procure technology that is accessible for people with disabilities. I think that's really essential.
My colleagues have touched on the issue of partnership. I think this is key in education. The problem for me up to now is that education is seen as a responsibility of educators or teachers. But education must involve everybody in society. It must involve the private sector, because they provide a lot of inputs into education. It must provide parents, because they send their children and they supervise their children. It must involve government, because it's a global public good, and the government has responsibility to provide this global public good. And the private sector, yes, they benefit from that, but it's in their interest that the schools and the universities are turning out the best graduates possible, because they are the consumers of the same graduates. So they have a vested interest in making sure that the product coming out of this system. So you can almost see that there is need for everybody to be involved, one way or another. And this is the only way I think we can advance this key area in Africa. Look, Africa has a lot of things going for it. It is the youngest continent with abundant natural resources. If you are talking about agriculture, if you exclude Amazonia in Brazil, it's only Africa which has got any areas left to exploit agriculture. But who is going to exploit this agriculture? It has to be skilled people. Who is going to exploit the resources of Africa? It has to be skilled people. And how do you get the skills? Through very efficient education and training systems. And so you can see a convergence, whether you are coming from Intel, you are coming from the government, you are coming from the disabled community, or you are an ex-minister of education. We are all converging on the importance of partnering together so that we can develop the best possible environment for education and training for Africa's youth.
The other challenge that we have is the content development, because doesn't suffice it just to have advice. We need a content there, you know. What I'm going to teach and how I'm going to produce these materials. This is a big challenge. We need, as from now, to start training teachers to be able to convert the materials into materials that can be used in these devices, computers, telephones, and so forth. And this also cannot just be limited to teachers. We do have, yes, editors who produce textbooks, manuals, books, and we need also to have a partnership with them so that all these materials that used to be sold, you know, in a traditional and classical way, you know, we had need a lot of paper to print and would kill so many trees for that. So to start producing this material in an electronic way and provide them cheaply to the people, then we'll be able really to revolutionize education.
Yeah, I think some of this is, Deputy Minister, is part of what technology can do, and some of it is what policy needs to do. And I think they come together here. For example, Intel has a program called Intel Teach. It's trained over the last 10 years 12 million people, 1.3 million teachers in Africa. So they can actually make a lesson plan, they can stand in front of children that grew up with technology when many of the teachers didn't, and they can run these lesson plans and be an effective coach. But you need a policy for the country that says, I want to get my teachers trained. I'm going to require that they be ICT trained, because the industry can't always push that through. We can provide the programs, the capacity, train the master teachers, but where there's a national program that says within so many years all my teachers will be ICT trained and they'll come out of colleges that way and the legacy teachers will be trained, that makes the program happen. Or you do the same in content. We have amazing engines for driving content to books, to PDFs, to interactive with webs and indexing and assessment tools. But many times the publishers say my business model is quite nice selling paper. So a policy is, okay, I require you as a supplier to have paper content and electronic content, and it runs on multiple platforms. I've seen that policy implemented in Russia, and within 1 year, it was very different talking to the content industry than the year before that policy existed. So together, the industry and the government, I think, can make many of these breakthroughs by, again, it's back to that private-public partnership and cooperation.
Development cooperation is really essential, that, and cooperation not just between countries but also between developers and vendors, so we can ensure that ICT is accessible. In Africa, 33 countries have ratified the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities, and that actually makes it very important that we do step up our efforts to ensure that ICT is accessible, that content is accessible, that teachers get the correct training. So all of these things are really necessary, especially now we look at the post-2015 development agenda. The children who are left out of school are mainly those with disabilities, so we need to prepare the setup for them to be able to learn. I was in Mozambique a few months ago, and I went to a school in Beira, a school for the blind, where the students there were actually using tablets, and their tutor was a lady from Italy, a country where the majority, 99% of children with disabilities are in regular schools there. And I thought that was really something to be proud of, Minister. I thought it was really great.
This conference highlights the need for private-public partnerships to enable these ICT platforms to see the light in Africa. So far, private partners are seemingly more interested in setting up in coastal countries. How do we convince them to invest in landlocked areas or fragile states?
I wouldn't want to talk about the landlocked countries, but I think we need, yes, to extend the fiber optic to those countries. We should facilitate the countries that are not along the coast just to have access to fiber optic. And how to acquire this fiber optic is something that probably, the governments themselves, they can just discuss this with also private companies, and so that they could find them, or buy them at affordable prices and extend them to the country. For example, in Mozambique now, just going back to the public-private partnership, we do have the company that I mentioned that extended fiber optic to all districts in the country, all districts, more actually than the government, the state itself could afford to, and they have got in all districts. And this is a great help, for the purposes of the government and also for the society, because they can have access to, cheaper internet and to many other technologies which are coming also with the internet.
I think that landlocked countries are not different from those close to the sea, because as the minister said, what perhaps may be lacking is visionary leadership. You look at Rwanda. Rwanda is totally landlocked. And which is the most networked country in Africa today? Probably Rwanda. So that answers your question. It's not really something to do with it. A lot of it has to do with leadership, and also a lot of it has to do with peace and stability. I was in South Sudan a few months back, and the situation there is so precarious. Never talk about fiber optic. People from UNICEF cannot even venture 50 miles outside Juba. So you have these larger problems. Just now we have seen the conflagration going on in Central Africa. I think it's not just a question of landlocked countries. One of the most important conditions for good education, for delivery of social services, and the peace and stability in Africa. That is key. But what is interesting here is the following: that we have at ADEA recognized that peace and education are complementary. We in fact have a working group, or an inter-country quality node, that looks at how education can build peace within a country through training. Because it's important for people to understand that just because you are different doesn't mean you should pick up an axe and start hacking somebody who looks different from you, who thinks differently from you. So again, I think that there's an important role for education to play in terms of creating the environment of social tolerance within society. Whether it's tolerance against disabled people, or against a different religion, against a different ethnic group, against a different language, against a different color. This is key. But I think at the top of it, we need visionary leadership.
I can show you education. I've visited over 100 countries in the last 5 or 6 years, and I get to see what happens there. And if I look at the most dramatic changes in education transformation, I can usually name you the person that's been right in the middle of that. And it reaches across the ICT ministry, it reaches across the education ministry, it'll often reach across various different branches of governments. But I can nearly always put the name of someone on that and say that person drove this change across many different government groups, recruited, worked with the private industry, told us what they needed to do, and we rallied around to do that. And so I think leadership is absolutely critical, and if without leadership, this doesn't happen very quickly. And I think your example of Rwanda is exactly the right one. You've got a visionary leadership there that says, I'm going to connect my country. Well, guess what? The country gets connected. I'm going to transform education, and that's the person that's going to do it. And then it tends to happen. And I think a lot of it comes down to leadership in industry and in government and that cooperation.
How do you convince governments, which are in the midst of warfare or coming out of crises, that putting education on top of their agenda is critical, and furthermore asking them to set aside a part of their budget for these ICT projects?
I can only cite the example of leadership, because without good leadership, I don't see that this would happen. I mean, I have seen a country I lived in before, which was at war, really transformed. I'm talking about Mozambique. I think you need leadership, because if you don't have leadership, pretty much else is going to fall by the wayside. But you also need to build the structures that are socially tolerant, because we saw countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya, which were examples of solidarity going into conflict. So it's not good enough to say we are a stable country, or what we saw in Tunisia. So it's not enough just to say we are a stable country, therefore it's okay, we can go to bed. You have to be proactive in building peace, because if you don't, it's like poverty. If you don't take certain measures, as we have seen in India and China, people who live on the borderline of poverty can always fall either back or move forward. So the same with peace. It's very fragile. It's a fragile commodity. You need to be proactive in promoting peace. If you are not proactive in promoting peace, and a lot of it has to do with leadership. And when I talk about leadership now, I'm not just talking about people at the top. People at every layer of society, they have a responsibility as leaders to promote peace.
I have to pick up on what Chairperson said about being proactive. You also have to be proactive in building relationships with governments as an NGO or as a private partner. And I think in South Sudan, I think 2 weeks ago, they were having a debate on reworking the curriculum framework, and Light for the World participated in that and gave input, and some of the issues in that curriculum framework touched on ICT. And we've put in things to make sure that children with disabilities are included in that framework, that they look at accessibility, accessible formats. So I think it's also about coming to a government and saying, and offering your help, and also showing evidence on how things work on the ground, because I think people appreciate that as well. And that's what this conference is all about, is this forum where people are sharing their best practices, showing how it can be done, because that's very valuable, and it speaks mountains, basically.
Mobile technology has spread like wildfire across Africa, and mobile phones are turning into very powerful tools to communicate in even the most remote communities. Community radios, for instance, are taking advantage of the mobile boom to create dialogue platforms with their listeners. Is Intel looking into using this mobile boom as well and adapting educational needs to this type of interface?
Well, technology has to run on every platform. You look at a Windows technology, it runs from PCs down to phones. You look at Android technology, it's from phones up through tablets and bigger tablets that become more like PCs. And so it runs on all of these. What we found is a lot more people on phones than computers in Africa. So you've got that part going for it. And I see a lot of use of mobile phones in what I call informal education. I want information, I want to understand this, I want to be able to look things up, I want to be able to get the information I need right now on this subject. It's a wonderful device for doing that. I call that the informal education side. I see less of it in the formal education side, where I don't see a classroom of 30 children around and the teacher with a phone and they're working across that. Simply the size and the richness and the screens and all of that just hasn't really gone into that space. But in informal, you see a tremendous amount of it, and it may be one of the largest education devices there is. And what we try and do is make sure content runs on all screens. We're inside some of those, we're not inside others of them, but making sure it runs on all of them is required.
I think what is interesting about technology, particularly telephones, and this is just a factoid which is useless. Many people don't even realize that Africa has more cell phones than India. That gives you an idea about the amount of penetration that has taken place in 20 years. So who knows, even when we are talking about tablets and all these other things. But what I wanted to say is that there are also sometimes what I would call negative consequences of technology if one is not careful, and particularly if one doesn't lay out the ground rules and regulations. And I'll give you an example. I won't quote the country. I go into this country, every teacher has a cell phone, and a teacher is teaching maths. The cell phone rings. The teacher picks up the phone, goes outside, talks for 20 minutes. He comes back, the lesson is over. He goes back in, the phone rings again. And I calculated that, just by not really making regulations, I used to work at the World Bank, but even now we're told to silence our phones. If you don't make regulations, some of this technology can come back to haunt you, because there are often negative consequences about just introducing a technology wholesale without making policies and guidelines on how it is used and when it is used.
We need also to link them with education, not just instruction. We need to educate people of how to use these technologies and how to take advantage of all the good things that technologies bring. Of course, we won't deter ourselves from embracing this technology because there's a negative part of it. So I think we need really to be more focused and be more optimistic and promote, those good values.
What are you getting out of this forum, and what will you be able to bring home with you, which you didn't have before coming?
Well, if you look at this forum, there's people there from all over the globe. There's people that have had millions of computers in schools in Argentina that have actually come here to share that. There's people from Malaysia that have come to the forum. There's people from Portugal that have come to the forum. So people have come from all over the globe, plus all over Africa. And what I believe is a lot of the issues and challenges have been solved by someone, somewhere. They know the answer. If you've had 3 million computers with children in Argentina for 5 years, you've probably learned a little bit about deployment there. Or if you've had every teacher trained and all the content electronic in Portugal for 5 years, you've learned something there. And so the forum is best practice sharing. And you've got some great programs in Africa, but you've got some really good experts that have come from all over the globe to share that. And the forum's got the right people here. And it's really a question of them sharing and comparing and learning from each other to put some of these forward, because you don't want to spend the next 2 years learning something that someone learned 3 years ago in a different country if they're willing to share that with you and help you jump ahead quicker. And I think we've got the right people there for that, the right industry people, the right government people, and the right global people. So let's share and let's advance.
Great, sharing experiences. So this is the key word. We need to share experiences from different angles. Those who advanced the more, what mistakes they made, so that we won't just repeat them. And also, it's very important here to, I think this is a platform where we can pick up some ideas. And at the same time, for example, what I had this morning, I had some sort of kind of reassurance that we're on the right track. Because sometimes, we think of certain policies, and when we're confronted in a situation like this and we hear what's happening in other countries, there's some sort also of reassurance that we're on the right track. So it's very important sharing all these experiences so that we can advance more rapidly.
I think when you come to an event like this, you always come with one basket full and one basket empty. And I think that empty basket I hope to share and learn from a lot of people and their experiences. And I think it would be great if we could also leave in this forum be mindful of accessibility for people with disabilities. And I think that would be crucial for me.
I want to repeat what my colleagues have said, except to say that I'm a perpetual student. I've already picked up ideas from this discussion, certainly about how you can leverage, some of these tablets, for example, among university students, by reducing taxation or by creating some incentives. I've learned about why it is important to make sure that people who are disabled are taken on board. So I think that I agree with my colleagues that this is an extraordinarily important learning opportunity for all of us. And I'm sure that we go back home enriched. But I certainly know that at ADEA, there are already a few things that we are going to do in terms of implementing the integration of ICT into education and training.
Thank you for this discussion and enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thank you.
Thanks.